China. If we could settle down quickly, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with Jeanne-Marie Gescher. And we're here because of her recently published book, Becoming China. And just a couple of words about Jeanne-Marie. She is a lawyer. She's a specialist in Chinese law. She visited China first, I think, in 1987. And she says she fell in love with the country. And since that time, she spent quite a lot of time there, over 2 decades. And this is her second book. Her first book was called All Under Heaven. And that was also about China. And this is also about China. And we're going to, between us, take you through some of the salient points in this book. This book is a bit different from most books on China because it covers the entire 5,000 years of Chinese space, but it's written in parts in a slightly ironic style, very lyrical, very easy to read, and it has a particular point of view which is different again because it deals considerably with the underdog, the dispossessed, the people who've suffered a great deal over the ages, and so that's rather different from usual. And I'd like to invite Jeanne-Marie, if she likes to say a word or two in general about the book now.
It works. Fantastic. Can everybody hear at the back? Wow, fantastic. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me here. Thank you very much. It's 33 years since I was last in Calcutta. And I think this is the only city I have visited after a few decades that I think is just as fabulous as it always was. So thank you very much for having me. I came to Calcutta almost on my way to China. I was going to Bangladesh to work with a man called Muhammad Yunus, who I think some of you met because he spoke at the beginning of this literary festival. And he changed my life. As Krishnan said, I'm a lawyer. But actually, I'm a lawyer who was really interested in human beings. And I couldn't work out how you could do lawyering and being human at the same time. And when I went to work with Muhammad Yunus, I found the answer. I've lived in China for nearly 30 years. The first 10 years were extraordinary. I'm not sure. How many people here, has anybody here been to China? Oh, wow, that's a lot. Okay. How many here think that you know a bit about China? Okay, so there's a multiple test question at the end of this session. I'll just test you all at the end. How's that? So, I spent quite a bit of time in India before I went to China. I actually went to live in China, although Krishnan is right. I first went to China in 1987. I went to teach at Peking University. But I went to live there in 1989. Does anybody know what happened on June the 4th, 1989? Okay. So, Tiananmen. So I arrived to live in China 1 week after Tiananmen. There wasn't even any petrol to come and get me from the airport. I was the only person on the plane going in. Everybody else was going out. And when I arrived, everybody said, "Why did you come? It's over. It's finished. It's all broken." And I thought maybe it wasn't. I was very lucky. What Krishnan very politely didn't say is that I had no training as a sinologist. When I went to live in China, I had done a 1-year foundation course in Chinese. I'd spent 3 months in Taiwan. My Chinese was pretty terrible. I had never studied Chinese history. I'd never studied Chinese politics. I just thought that China was going to be the place that would think very deeply about what development would be. And my big question was what development would be. As a lawyer, I specialized in something called competition law, antitrust, like the trying to control big businesses, a bit what those guys were talking about earlier here. When I worked with Muhammad Yunus on the Grameen Bank, I thought a lot about development, but it was all about economics. And I thought, how can you have development if it's just about economics? And then I became familiar with economic development theory, and I thought that China, because it was opening up, would have an interesting perspective. Of course, here in India, you also have a really interesting perspective. And I think Krishnan was encouraging me to think about the contrasts and comparisons between India and China. And I would say that probably the biggest, as in India, you've looked at social and human development in a very human way. China has done economic development spectacularly. As part of its economic development, it's looked at social development, but in a very orderly way. And if you look at this, Krishnan is right, this is a really big book. So you can read any chapter you like. If you read it from beginning to end, that's a big story, but you can also read any chapter you like. But it's really not just the story of China, it's the story of the question of order. For the Chinese, the big question was, how do we live together as human beings? So if we go back 5,000, 6,000 years ago, when the shamans first settled the Chinese people, they, as everywhere else in the world, they looked at the sky, they looked at the earth, they tried to work out how everything worked. And their big question was, how do we live together with each other? And how do we live with nature? And their earliest answer was an answer that as Indians you would understand really well. Their answer was that we need to meditate deeply, we need to think deeply about the nature that we find ourselves in. And we need to understand that this cosmos is full of changes. There's nothing permanent here. We need to adapt and understand. They were so successful at doing that they created a very strong agricultural society. And at that point, some of the shamans said, this is like quite a big deal. And it's quite complicated making sure everything works. There should be one person at the top who tells everybody what to do. And the other shaman said, are you crazy? We know that everything changes. We know that the cosmos is a really complicated place. Surely the only way to have peace and security is for each human being to cultivate themselves, to take responsibility for being human with each other. And that began what I describe in this book as a 5,000-year battle. At the moment, you only see the single top-down mind, but this is a 5,000-year battle between two very different ways of thinking about the world.
I think it's a good, I think that Jean-Marie is rather galloped ahead here, but let me just touch on one point she mentioned. This is the 5,000 years question. Now, what do you think, Jean-Marie? You've got a very ancient civilization in China, and there are other ancient civilizations in the world as well. The Greek, the Egyptian, the Indian, of course. Let's just pause for a moment. Could you give some couple of points maybe where the Chinese civilizational basis is different from or special in respect of the Indian one?
Well, the first observation I'd make is that I couldn't think of two more different ideas about civilization. And in fact, in the 1920s, a very interesting Chinese said that there were three great civilizations in the world in a hierarchy. And the bottom is still important, but the bottom was the West, which believed that it could tame nature. The middle was China, because it believed in bending to nature. And the most important was India, because it believed in a universal consciousness. But if we go back to Krishnan's question, which is, the civilizational Chinese ideas, the very first mythological people in
No,
China.
I'd like to pause you here for a moment, just I'd like you to tell me what is different between the Chinese civilization, what's different and special about Chinese civilization when compared to the Indian thousands of years of history.
Okay.
If anything,
well,
perhaps
totally, totally different. So the original Chinese idea, which is still the Chinese idea, is how do we create peace and security on this earth without thinking about anything beyond. So most of you probably are familiar with a man called Confucius. And Confucius said, what is the point in thinking about life after death if we can't even work out how to manage life on earth? That seems to me to be a fundamental point of difference. The other was very early on in China, a view that it was a view of power, that it was important to have only one conversation with heaven. So there was an idea that there was a heaven, that there was something more important than people. But the story, I'd like to tell a short mythical story, although it's probably true. The grandson of the Yellow Emperor, apparently, like many of the early emperors, was struggling with the Yellow River, which kept jumping its banks and drowning people in their fields. And he asked the shamans to make some offerings to the ancestors and asked the ancestors what was going wrong. And the ancestors said, too many people asking questions. They keep waking us up at night. We're up there having a nice time, and all these people keep sending up their offerings and asking us questions, and it's just like too much bother. We don't want all the questions. And so Zhuan Xu said, okay, from now on, we will only have one conversation with heaven, and that will be the conversation of the emperor with heaven. That is a fundamentally different view. Now, of course, on the ground, across China, ordinary people carried on making their offerings and having their gods, and many different gods. But over time, what we've seen is exactly that the idea of another world is narrowed to the idea of one single great man.
And in the book, of course, the word heaven appears a great deal, heaven, heavenly. And there are other symbols also. There's the crouching dragon, there's the monkey king, and these symbols are prevalent through the pages of the book. Now, what do these symbols really represent?
The idea of heaven has to be seen together with the idea of earth. So there's heaven above, there's earth below. Man stands between, and it's the responsibility of man to hold up heaven and keep his feet on earth. That, of course, became a responsibility of an emperor. So we have an expression all under heaven, Tianxia, which is this idea of an orderly kingdom where the ruler is holding up heaven and respecting the earth. I much prefer the stories of Zhuge Liang, the crouching dragon, and particularly the story of the Monkey King. So there's one very interesting thing about China, and Krishnan, we had a conversation yesterday evening, and he asked me some very interesting questions and made some interesting points. One of them was that he said he was surprised that within the Chinese Communist Party, there are many different factions, that it isn't just one point of view, which is absolutely true. What's even more interesting is that within the Communist Party, it's not just that there are different views. It's like a family. In fact, the early founders of the Communist Party saw themselves as a family, and as time passed, they had children of their own, and it's like some crazy family. You don't see much. Every now and then, you get a kind of snapshot of it. So do you remember a man called Bo Xilai? Anybody remember? Did you remember he was a contender against Xi Jinping, who the present president and general secretary is a man called Xi Jinping. Sorry? What did he say? He locked up. Yeah, he's in the slammer. That's right, he's locked up. So Bo Xilai was like a present-day Monkey King. The story of the Monkey King was written in the 14th century. It was written by a man who thought a lot about Buddhism. You know, a lot of Buddhist ideas went to China from India. Also, the story of the Ramayana went to China, and that idea of Hanuman. And so this author had this idea, oh, a monkey king, you know, how interesting. Actually, in the Chinese story, the Monkey King is a total maniac. He's bad, he's disruptive, he makes chaos everywhere. And he's so bad that the Jade Emperor, who's a creation of an earlier Song Dynasty emperor, that emperor was having a very hard time. And when he tried to instill order, he decided to come up with a heavenly counterpart called the Jade Emperor, who had a mirror image of the whole government on earth. And the story is that the Jade Emperor thought the Monkey King was so bad that he sent him to the stables to look after the horses. Does anybody know the story of Xuanzang, the Chinese monk who came to India? So in the 6th century, there was a Chinese monk who came to India and spent 20 years traveling around India looking for the Buddhist texts. So this story, written in the 14th century, is a fiction about the Monkey King, about that monk coming to India and the Monkey King being sent to accompany him. And it's the story of all the crazy things that happen with him. So Bo Xilai is like a Monkey King. He was crazy. He disregarded all the rules. And that is one of the really interesting things about China, that although from the outside it looks as if everything works like clockwork, within there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on.
Well, in China, sometimes things they aren't really what they appear to be. So there are several riddles and problems in arriving at reality. And here, of course, the book itself is called Becoming China, which is also, in a way, a play on words. But we leave that till later. Let's come now to slightly more present times. I think that Jean-Marie has said that the rise of China is a miracle only if we don't count the cost. And the cost, of course, is in terms of millions of people who have suffered since the Communist Revolution. That is the purges, the Great Famine, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen, etc., these huge upheavals which created an enormous amount of casualties in China. And when you consider that in the last century there have been so many traumatic events in China, at the present time, Jean-Marie, would the Chinese regard this as being probably the best of times?
You know, that's such an interesting question. It's a very heavily debated question because since nobody can vote in China, nobody knows what the Chinese people think. In the last part of my book, I take 3 chapters to tell the story of the years from 1989 to 2010 through the perspective of 3 different groups of people. One is the Communist Party itself. One is the people as a whole, 1.4 billion people, and they really are 1.4 billion individuals. In fact, some Chinese say that the reason why they have to have a tough order is that they are all such individuals that they could never manage to live together if they didn't have such a tight order. And the third is what in China are called the intellectuals. Actually, you are all intellectuals. Anybody who's read a book and has an opinion in China is an intellectual. But the intellectuals have a special role in China because, in my opinion, they're the inheritors of the shamans. They're the ones who ask the difficult questions. So the big question today is, what do China's people think? And I think it depends a bit who you are. I think that probably the majority of the 1.4 billion people think that they are better off in China than they would be anywhere else. That doesn't mean they think that this is the best of all times, but when they look at Trump in America, they look at Brexit in Britain, they think, you know, maybe we're in a better place. I think the party, interestingly, because the party, there are 88 million party members. Of course, if you're at the top of the party, it's always been quite a good place to be. But until recently, if you were one of the 88 million party members, that was also a pretty good place to be. But now, Xi Jinping is saying, party? that's a responsibility, not a right. If you're a party member, you have to rectify yourself. So do you remember when Xi Jinping first became General Secretary President? That winter, he was filmed eating very simple food in a cafe. Do you remember that? Did you ever see that? So that was the warning shot. No more banquets. China used to be famous for having big official banquets. Now it's 4 buns and a soup. Very, very simple food. That wasn't why many people joined the Communist Party. So a lot of people in the Communist Party are kind of thinking, oh, I'm not so sure I like this so much. The intellectuals are having a very hard time. Many of them have been arrested. Many of them have left the country. So I think it depends, is the answer.
Well, in China, during the Mao period, during these huge upheavals up to the middle of the 70s, you called it a nightmare of lies. And since that time, of course, the centralization of power in China has continued. In China, leaders from Mao onwards have evoked the first Qin emperor, that is 2nd century BC, and of course Confucius, who you mentioned earlier, in a way as endorsement of a very strong centralized government. And this centralized government is all-powerful. It cannot be challenged or debated. And you've said, Jean-Marie, that it's extremely hard work to be Chinese. And you've further said, I think, that one of the options of becoming Chinese is leaving the country and the party. Now, would you elaborate on that?
Okay, well, it's actually very hard to leave the party. In fact, there's a big debate going on at the moment about technically whether it's possible to leave the party. The question of being Chinese is also a big question. I don't know how much you followed what's been going on with, it's been a bit of a soap opera. As Xi Jinping has centralized control, a number of Chinese have left, particularly very rich Chinese and many intellectuals. And outside China, many of them have gone to America. Some of them are broadcasting back to China stories about the leadership that the leadership is not very happy about. The authorities in China are saying, you know, if you're born Chinese, you are Chinese wherever you are in the world. You can go to America, but we go to America and bring you back. We have stories of people who were born Chinese but have lived abroad, or even their parents moved abroad and they were born abroad, but they are racially Chinese, going back to China and being subjected to Chinese law and arrested, particularly people working for NGOs. So, you know, this question of what it means to be Chinese is a big question. I'd like to take it just one step further and say, you know, apart from the practical questions about, you know, can you ever stop being Chinese, or can you ever stop being a party member? Actually, the Chinese would mostly argue that their country, which was, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, China did not see itself as a state when the Europeans arrived in the mid-19th century. They saw themselves as a world. They didn't think of themselves in terms of other states. They had no concept of that. And they saw themselves as a way of thinking. So they described themselves as a civilization. And one of the big questions of the 21st century is going to be China's idea of itself as a civilization, which is a much bigger idea than China's idea of itself as a state. It means that China's way of thinking is a way of thinking that the Chinese want to see incorporated into the world idea of what it means to have order.
I'd like to take you back to the Chinese Communist Party and the highly centralized form of government they have. Now, this, in a way, is connected with the great man theory of history. That's been very strong in China. The great man, omnipotent, all-knowing, omniscient, and can't be challenged. Now, and yet, as we just touched on earlier, there are contrary opinions within the party itself. Now, Jeanne-Marie, in her book, she describes this metaphorically as east winds and west winds. This, I think, was after the Gang of Four and after Mao's time. Now, the east winds represent really the hardliners. They represent the people who want to go back to the pristine period of Marxism. The west winds are in favor of greater productivity, greater economic but not political reform. And this dialectic has continued in China over the years. It's subterranean. One doesn't really, one can't really get a grasp on it. But Jean-Marie, where do you think this is heading?
Oh, the east winds have won. Absolutely. So Xi Jinping would be a very strong east wind, such a strong east wind that the west winds have been blown away completely. Can I ask a question of the audience? Yes? Can I do my own little, I hate referenda. I think they're very stupid things, but I'd like to do a little referendum here. It's not really a referendum, it's actually more of a question. How many people here, I hope this is an appropriate question to ask. If it's not, please just shout at me and I'll stop asking it. How many people here are communist or believe in the communist ideal? No, okay. The reason I ask this question is that it seems to me there are many different ideas about what communism is. My husband is a Malayali, so I spend some time in Trivandrum, which has many communist parties. All of them have different ideas about what it means to be communist. I had the privilege of having breakfast with one of my fellow speakers this morning, who told me that Mao was one of his great heroes, and I can understand that. Mao was an extraordinary figure. The thing about communism in China is that it began 5,000 years ago. It began with a ruler who was a farmer, who said, you know, we're going to farm together. We're going to be equal. We're not going to have a high and a low. And for 5,000 years, that has been an ideal. And every time that didn't happen, there was what was called a Taiping rebellion. Taiping means great peace. You'd think great peace was peaceful. Well, the Great Peace rebellions were very unpeaceful. The latest of them was in the 19th century. The big Taiping rebellion, many people will be familiar with, in 1850. But there were Taiping rebellions all through China's story. So the big thing to understand about China's Communist Party is what it learned from Russia. The Communist Party in China was founded by Moscow. Mao Zedong was not one of the founders. It was joined by many great Chinese intellectuals, people you would love. I mean, people who would be like people from Calcutta, people who love music, literature, art, being human, fabulous people. But when it was founded with a very strong idea that there should be a Leninist element. And Moscow invited the young communists to go to Moscow and learn about Leninism. And one of those beneficiaries, he didn't go to Moscow, but one of the people who spent a lot of time studying was a man called Mao Zedong. And Mao used that Leninist idea to reshape the Communist Party. So today, I personally think that communism can be anything. It can be left or right. I mean, and you talk about East and West, those East and West winds. Those were the winds that Deng Xiaoping had to battle.
You talk about them.
I talk, but no, but you raised them. Because those East and West winds came out at a time when, in a sense, there was not a democracy, but there was a big debate about China. At the end of Mao, Deng Xiaoping inherited a wreck. No economy, very poor people starving, no infrastructure, really backward country. And Deng Xiaoping said, what are we going to do? This is a total mess. And his idea was actually an idea, do you remember I said at the beginning of time, were the shamans who believed in meditation and thinking, deeply. He did a bit of that. And he said, okay, we've got all these Chinese who ran away because they didn't like the responsibility of the Chinese world, but they made money. Let's have them back. And so he invited them all to come back and make China rich.
So you believe that basically the East winds are, that is to say, the hardliners are going to win, or winning at the moment, and that Xi Jinping represents that body of opinion. Let's just talk about Xi Jinping for a moment or two. Now, Xi Jinping, when he first came to power, which was about 6 years ago, he had this first kind of policy was back to the masses. So the party people were sent back to the masses to learn from the countryside. His second big policy was anti-corruption. And now we have a policy, a different one again, which is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, where exactly is this going?
Okay, well, socialism with Chinese characteristics has been with us since Deng Xiaoping. Does everybody know who Deng Xiaoping was? A very small man from Sichuan. He was the successor to Mao Zedong. Sorry? Yes. Yes, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So very pragmatic. And that's a very long Chinese tradition. That wasn't just uniquely Deng Xiaoping. It wasn't so much Mao Zedong, though. So very pragmatic. And Deng's idea was exactly that, to get rich. My personal view, can I just repeat your question, which is, I think, where do I think we're going next?
I think that I was speaking about the socialism with Chinese characteristics, and where do you think this is heading?
So first of all, I need to say that when they came up, it was a man called Jiang Zemin who came up with the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Nobody knows what it means. Nobody knew what it meant at the time. One of the things that China does is to accept contradictions. And so so socialism and Chinese characteristics looks as if they were two very different things. And what they've done is, as they've walked forward, they've tried to work out what that is. What Xi Jinping says socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism. At the heart of socialism, isn't there a big question about whether we can have freedom and equality at the same time? So the Chinese characteristics is there's no freedom without responsibility.
I think we're bumping against against time here. So I just want to take Jean-Marie to the India-China question, because I think that that's relevant for us being in India. Now, just very briefly, just 2 or 3 questions about India. Do you think that India, from, let us say, the independence movement onwards, had misunderstood China? Because you know that we supported the Chinese during Sun Yat-sen and after Sun Yat-sen. We supported the Chinese against the Japanese. We sent a medical team to which eventually traveled with Mao along the Long March. Nehru said before independence, 1946, that China, our great friend, has been our friend across the ages, and this friendship will endure and grow. Now, and yet this emotional side in India wasn't matched by reciprocity in China. China was much more transactional throughout. Did we actually fundamentally misunderstand China from the beginning?
Nehru misunderstood China. Nehru was a man, he was an extraordinary man, and also, as you put it yourself, a man who believed in human relationships. Mao Zedong did not believe in human relationships. Mao Zedong believed in a Leninist power. Sadly, had Nehru understood the story of how Mao Zedong himself came to power, he would have anticipated what Mao did. Mao did to Nehru what Mao did to all of the young intellectuals within the Communist Party, which was that when he needed to acquire territory, he pushed Nehru aside. Mao wanted to be leader of the world. He wanted to be leader of the communist world. And that was a position that he thought that Nehru might be a challenger to.
Although China is our neighbor across 4,000 kilometers, actually the level of ignorance about China in India, though many of you obviously have been there, is very profound. And there was a Czech academic friend of mine who said that nowhere is the reputation of China as low in the world as it is in India. And that is taking, let us say, countries like Japan into consideration, which have had, and Vietnam, which have had very, very severe difficulties through history with China. And yet, when Xi Jinping came here in 2014, a radio announcer on a Doordarshan, which is a government channel, she called Xi Jinping President 11. Now, if you don't understand that, please ask your next door neighbor. But that is, quite crass ignorance about China. Now, how do you think this gap can be bridged?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of British television presenters who still can't pronounce his name either. So I think President 11 is pretty creative. how do we deal with that gap? You know, from the first time, my first days in China, I realized that China understood nothing of India. And my time in India, I understand that India understands very little of China. I can't think of two countries that understand each other less, and your neighbors. But you've got the excuse of the Himalayas in between. You know, I actually think the answer is you need to make a movie about each other. So I think that's probably the only way forward.
Maybe the Monkey King will help here. Now, I think we've got time for a couple of questions, and I'd be very happy to recognize you, sir.
Ma'am, I have been living with a puzzle ever since I grown up that in your long stay in China, whenever you researched on Chinese Communist Party, have you ever come across with any testimonial evidence that Chinese Communist Party ever supported Indian armed struggle by Indian communists in 1967 to 69? Because Indian communists, they always claimed they had huge support from Beijing, but there is no evidence on that. What is your take on this?
Okay, so I haven't looked at it specifically, but here's my take. First of all, between 1967 and 69, China was involved in the Cultural Revolution, which was a phenomenon of such extraordinary violence that it's hard to imagine anybody in China taking an interest in anything anywhere else. But the party in China has an organization called the United Front, which does build relationships with other organizations outside China. So it's possible that the United Front expressed some sympathy for them, is the best answer I can give you.
Two very quick questions.
Yes,
I'm sorry, the
question.
gentleman. No,
Okay.
sure.
First, I wanted to tell you, because of Chouinen Lai, he came to Calcutta late 50s, okay? At that time, lot of intellectual people were invited by China from Calcutta. So we have very lot of novel, lot of writings about a great writer from Calcutta. So when I went to 2000 China, that time I have seen that way that writers, even my grandfather, he went to China late 50s, and there is no matching. Okay, because a lot of big because of American people, they pouring the money, and lot of big hotel, lot of big business.
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you short. Please
What's
ask
the
the question.
Okay, question is, I wanted to tell you, what do you feel? Because 56 or 57, we know about China. And 2000, when I went there, because of what I felt, I think, you'll be agreed or not, Mao Zedong is the one made Chinese people disciplined. Okay? All I felt it.
Yep, there is a very strong
Question, and this is the...
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people would agree with that. I'm not sure people would agree it was a good thing, but I think they would agree with it.
I'm extremely sorry, but we have very many celebrities going to talk about cricket immediately after us, and I'm going to, of course, join the audience as well. But I've been asked to wrap up this session. I'm extremely sorry. But I'd like to thank Jean-Marie Gescher for her kindness in coming on and giving us a very interesting presentation. And her next book is going to be about India, probably much the same size. So we look forward to that when it comes out. Thank you.
Great audience. Thanks a lot.